Queen Lucia by E.F. Benson. Read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter 13. Spiritualism and all things pertaining to it swept over Riseholme like the amazing growth of some tropical forest, germinating and shooting out its surprising vegetation and rearing into huge fantastic shapes. In the centre of this wonderful jungle was a temple, so to speak, and that temple was the house of Mrs. Quantock. A strange providence was the origin of it all. Mrs. Quantock, a week before, had the toothache, and, being no longer in the fold of Christian Science, found that it was no good at all to tell herself that it was a false claim. False claim it may be, but it was so plausible at once that it quite deceived her, and she went up to London to have its falsity demonstrated by a dentist. Since the collapse of yoga and the flight of the curry cook, she had embarked on no mystical adventure, and she starved for some new fad. Then, when her first visit to the dentist was over, the tooth required 3 treatments, and she went to a vegetarian restaurant to see if there was anything enlightening to be got out of that, she was delighted to find herself sitting at a very small table with a very communicative lady who ate cabbages in perfectly incredible quantities. She had a round, pale face like the moon behind the clouds, enormous eyebrows that almost met over her nose, and a strange, low voice of husky tone, and a pronunciation quite as foreign as Signor Cortese's. She wore some very curious rings with large engraved amethysts and turquoises in them, and since in the first moments of their conversation she had volunteered the information that vegetarianism was the only possible diet for any who were cultivating their psychical powers, Mrs. Quantock asked her if these weird finger ornaments had any mystical signification. They had. One was Gnostic, one was Rosicrucian, and the other was Kabbalistic. It is easy to picture Mrs. Quantock's delight. Adventure had met her with smiling mouth and mysterious eyes. In the course of an animated conversation of half an hour, the lady explained that if Mrs. Quantock was, like her, a searcher after psychical truths, and cared to come to her flat at 4:30 that afternoon, she would try to help her. She added with some little diffidence that the fee for a seance was a guinea, and as she left, took a card out of a case encrusted with glowing rubies and gave it to her. That was the Princess Popoffski. Now here was a curious thing. For the last few evenings at Riseholme, Mrs. Quantock had been experimenting with a table, and found that it creaked and tilted and tapped in the most encouraging way when she and Robert laid their hands on it. Then something, whatever it was that moved the table, had indicated by raps that her name was Daisy and his Robert, as well as giving them other information which could not so easily be verified. Robert had grown quite excited about it, and was vexed that the seances were interrupted by his wife's expedition to London. But now how providential that was! She had walked straight from the dentist into the arms of Princess Popoffski. It was barely 4:30 when Mrs. Quantock arrived at the Princess's flat, in a pleasant, quiet side street off Charing Cross Road. A small, dapper little gentleman received her, who explained that he was the Princess's secretary, and conducted her through several small rooms into the presence of the Sibyl. These rooms, so Mrs. Quantock thrillingly noticed, were dimly lit by oil lamps that stood in front of shrines, containing images of the great spiritual guides, from Moses down to Madame Blavatsky. A smell of incense hung about, there were vases of flowers on the tables, and strange caskets set with winking stones. In the last of these rooms the Princess was seated, and for the moment Mrs. Quantock hardly recognized her, for she wore a blue robe which left her massive arms bare, and up them writhed serpent-shaped bracelets of many coils. She fixed her eyes on Mrs. Quantock as if she had never seen her before, and made no sign of recognition. "The Princess has been meditating," said the secretary in a whisper. "She'll come to herself presently." For a moment meditation unpleasantly reminded Mrs. Quantock of the Guru, but nothing could have been less like that ill-starred curry cook than this majestic creature. Eventually she gave a sigh and came out of her meditation. "Ah, it is my friend," she said. "Do you know that you have a purple halo?" This was very gratifying, especially when it was explained that only the most elect had purple halos, and soon other elect souls assembled for the seance. In the centre of the table was placed a musical box and a violin, and hardly had the circle been made and the lights turned down when the most extraordinary things began to happen. A perfect storm of rappings issued from the table, which began to rock violently, and presently there came peals of laughter in a high voice, and those who had been here before said that it was Pocky. He was a dear naughty boy, so Mrs Quantock's neighbour explained to her, so full of fun, and when on earth had been a Hungarian violinist. Still invisible, Pocky wished them all much laughter and joy, and then suddenly said, "Hullo, hullo, here's a new friend. I like her." And Mrs Quantock's neighbour, with a touch of envy in her voice, told her that Pocky clearly meant her. Then Pocky said that they had been having heavenly music on the other side that day, and that if the new friend would say please, he would play them some of it. So Mrs Quantock, trembling with emotion, said, "Please, Pocky," and instantly he began to play on the violin the spirit tune which he had just been playing on the other side. After that the violin clattered back on to the middle of the table again, and Pocky, blowing showers of kisses to them all, went away amid peals of happy laughter. Silence fell, and then a deep bass voice said, "I am coming, Amadeo." And out of the middle of the table appeared a faint luminousness. It grew upwards and began to take form. Swathes of white muslin shaped themselves in the darkness, and there appeared a white face in among the topmost folds of the muslin, with a Roman nose and a melancholy expression. He was not gay like Pocky, but he was intensely impressive, and spoke some lines in Italian when asked to repeat a piece of Dante. Mrs Quantock knew they were Italian because she recognized notte and uno and caro, familiar words on Lucia's lips. The seance came to an end, and Mrs Quantock, having placed a guinea with the utmost alacrity in a sort of offertory plate, which the Princess Secretary negligently but prominently put down on a table in one of the other rooms, waited to arrange for another seance. But most unfortunately the Princess was leaving town next day on a much-needed holiday, for she had been giving 3 seances a day for the last 2 months and required rest. "Yes, we're off tomorrow, the Princess and I," said he, "for a week at the Royal Hotel at Brinton. Pleasant bracing air always sets her up. But after that she'll be back in town. Do you know that part of the country?" Daisy could hardly believe her ears. "Brinton," she said. "I live close to Brinton." Her whole scheme flashed completely upon her, even as Athene sprang full grown from the brain of Zeus. "Do you think that she might be induced to spend a few days with me at Riseholme?" she said. "My husband and I are so much interested in psychical things. You would be our guest too, I hope. If she rested for a few days at Brinton first, if she came on to me afterwards, and then if she was thoroughly rested, perhaps she would give us a seance or two, or I don't know." Mrs Quantock felt a great diffidence in speaking of guineas in the same sentence with the princesses, and had to make another start. "If she were thoroughly rested," she said, "and if a little circle perhaps of 4 at the usual price would be worth her while, just after dinner, you know, and nothing else to do all day but rest. There are pretty drives and beautiful air, all very quiet, and I think I may say more comfortable than the hotel. It would be such a pleasure." Mrs Quantock heard the clinking of bracelets from the room where the Princess was still reposing, and there she stood in the door, looking unspeakably majestic but very gracious. So Mrs Quantock put her proposition before her, the secretary coming to the rescue on the subject of the usual fees, and when 2 days afterwards Mrs Quantock returned to Riseholme, it was to get ready the spare room and Robert's room next to it for these thrilling visitors, whose first séance Georgie and Piggy had attended on the evening of the Italian débacle. The Quantocks had taken a high and magnificent line about the usual fees for the séances, An expensive line, but then Romanian oils had been extremely prosperous lately. No mention whatever of these fees was made to their guests, no offertory plate was put in a prominent position in the hall, there was no fumbling for change or the discreet pressure of coins into the secretary's hand. The entire cost was borne by Romanian oils. The Princess and Mrs. Quantock apparently were old friends. They spoke to each other at dinner as dear friend, and the Princess declared in the most gratifying way that they had been most intimate in a previous incarnation, without any allusion to the fact that in this incarnation they had met for the first time last week at a vegetarian restaurant. She was kind enough, it was left to be understood, to give a little seance after dinner at the house of her dear friend, and so publicly the question of money never came up. Now the Princess was to stay 3 nights, and therefore as soon as Mrs. Quantock had made sure of that, she proceeded to fill up each of the seances without asking Lucia to any of them. It was not that she had not fully forgiven her for her odious grabbing of the Guru, for she had done that on the night of the Spanish quartet. It was rather that she meant to make sure that there would by no possibility be anything to forgive concerning her contact with regard to the Princess. Lucia could not grab her, and so call Daisy's powers of forgiveness into play again if she never came near her, and Daisy meant to take proper precautions that she should not come near her. Accordingly, Georgie and Piggy were asked to the first seance. If it did not go very well, it would not particularly matter with them. Olga and Mr. Shuttleworth were bidden to the second, and Lady Ambermere with Georgie again to the third. This, quite apart from the immense interest of psychic phenomena, was deadly work, for it would be bitter indeed to Lucia to know, as she most undoubtedly would, that Lady Ambermere, who had cut her so firmly, was dining twice and coming to a seance. Daisy, it must again be repeated, had quite forgiven Lucia about the Guru, but Lucia must take the consequences of what she had done. It was after the first seance that the frenzy for spiritualism seized Riseholme. The Princess, with great good nature, gave some further exhibitions of her psychical power in addition to the seances, and even as Georgie the next afternoon was receiving Lucia's cruel verdict about Debussy, the Sibyl was looking at the hands of Colonel Boucher and Mrs. Weston, and unerringly probing into their past, and lifting the corner of the veil, giving them both glimpses into the future. She knew that the two were engaged, for that she had learned from Mrs. Quantock in her morning's drive, and did not attempt to conceal the fact. But how could it be accounted for that, looking impressively from the one to the other, she said that a woman no longer young but tall and with fair hair had crossed their lives and had been connected with one of them for years past? It was impossible to describe Elizabeth more accurately than that, and Mrs. Weston in high excitement confessed that her maid, who had been with her for 15 years, entirely corresponded with what the Princess had seen in her hand. After that it took only a moment's further scrutiny for the Princess to discover that Elizabeth was going to be happy too. Then she found that there was a man connected with Elizabeth, and Colonel Boucher's hand, to which she transferred her gaze, trembled with delightful anticipation. She seemed to see a man there, she was not quite sure, but was there a man who perhaps had been known to him for a long time? There was. And then by degrees the affairs of Elizabeth and Atkinson were unerringly unravelled. It was a little wonder that the Colonel pushed Mrs. Weston's bath chair with record speed to Ye Sign of Ye Daffodil, and by the greatest good luck obtained a copy of the Palmist's Manual. At another of these informal seances attended by Goosey and Mrs. Antrobus, even stranger things had happened, for the Princess's hands, as they held a little preliminary conversation, began to tremble and twitch even more strongly than Colonel Boucher's, and Mrs. Quantock hastily supplied her with a pencil and a quantity of sheets of foolscap paper, for this trembling and twitching implied that Reskia, an ancient Egyptian priestess, was longing to use the Princess's hand for automatic writing. After a few wild scrawls and plunges with the pencil, the princess, though she still continued to talk to them, covered sheet after sheet in large flowing handwriting. This, when it was finished and the princess sunk back in her chair, proved to be the most wonderful spiritual discourse, describing the happiness and harmony which pervaded the whole universe, and was only temporarily obscured by the mists of materiality. These mists were wholly withdrawn from the vision of those who had passed over. They lived in the midst of song and flowers and light and love. Towards the end there was a less intelligible passage about fire from the clouds. It was rendered completely intelligible the very next day, when there was a thunderstorm, surely an unusual occurrence in November. If that had not happened, Mrs. Quantock's interpretation of it as referring to zeppelins would have been found equally satisfactory. It was no wonder, after that Mrs. Antrobus, Piggy, and Goosey spent long evenings with pencils and paper, for the princess said that everybody had the gift of automatic writing if they would only take pains and patience to develop it. Everybody had his own particular guide, and it was the very next day that Piggy obtained a script clearly signed Annabel Nicostratus, and Jamifleg followed very soon after for her mother and sister, and so there was no jealousy. But the crown and apex of these manifestations was undoubtedly the 3 regular seances which took place to the 3 select circles after dinner. Musical boxes resounded, violins gave forth ravishing airs, the sitters were touched by unseen fingers when everybody's hands were touching all around the table, and from the middle of it materializations swathed in muslin were built up. Pocky came, visible to the eye, and played spirit music. Amadeo, melancholy impressive, recited Dante, and Cardinal Newman, not visible to the eye but audible to the ear, joined in the singing "Lead, Kindly Light," which the secretary requested them to encourage him with, and blessed them profusely at the conclusion. Lady Ambermere was so much impressed and so nervous of driving home alone that she insisted on Georgie's going back to the hall with her, and consigning her person to Pug and Miss Lyall, and for the 3 days of the princess's visit there was practically no subject discussed at the parliaments on the green except the latest manifestations. Olga went to town for a crystal, and Georgie for a planchette, and Riseholme temporarily became a spiritualistic republic, with the princess as priestess and Mrs. Quantock as president. Lucia all this time was almost insane with pique and jealousy, for she sat in vain waiting for an invitation to come to a seance, and would, long before the 3 days were over, have welcomed with enthusiasm a place at one of the inferior and informal exhibitions. Since she could not procure the princess for dinner, she asked Daisy to bring her to lunch or tea, or at any hour, day or night, which was convenient. She made Peppino hang about opposite Daisy's house with orders to drop his stick or let his hat blow off if he saw even the secretary coming out of the gate, so as possibly to enter into conversation with them, while she positively forced herself one morning into Daisy's hall and cried "Margherita" in silvery tones. On this occasion Margherita came out of the drawing-room with the most determined expression on her face, and shut the door carefully behind her. "Dearest Lucia," she said, "how nice to see you. What is it?" "I just popped in for a chat," said she. "I haven't set eyes on you since the evening of the Spanish quartet." "No, so long ago as that, is it? Well, you must come in again sometime, very soon, won't you? The day after tomorrow I shall be much less busy. Promise to look in then." "You have a visitor with you, have you not?" asked Lucia desperately. "Yes, 2 indeed, dear friends of mine, but I'm afraid you would not like them. I know your opinion about anything connected with spiritualism, and, isn't it silly of us, we've been dabbling in that." "Oh, but how interesting," said Lucia. I am always ready to learn, and alter my opinions if I'm wrong." Mrs. Quantock did not move from in front of the drawing-room door. "Yes," she said, "then we will have a great talk about it when you come to see me the day after tomorrow. But I know I shall find you hard to convince." She kissed the tips of her fingers in a manner so hopelessly final that there was nothing to do but go away. Then, with poor generalship, Lucia altered her tactics, and went up to the village green where Piggy was telling Georgie about the script signed Annabel. This was repeated again for Lucia's benefit. "Wasn't it too lovely?" said Piggy. "So Annabel's my guide, and she writes a hand quite unlike mine." Lucia gave a little scream and put her finger to her ears. "Gracious me," she said, "what has come over Riseholme? Wherever I go I hear nothing but talk of seances and spirits and automatic writing. Such a pack of nonsense, my dear Piggy. I wonder at a sensible girl like you." Mrs Weston, propelled by the Colonel, whirled up in her bath chair. "The palmist's manual is too wonderful," she said, "and Jacob and I sat up over it till I don't know what hour. There's a break in his line of life just at the right place when he was so ill in Egypt, which is most remarkable. And when Tommy Luton brought round my bath chair this morning, I had it at the garden door, because the gravel's just laid at my front door, and the wheels sink so far into it. 'Tommy,' I said, 'let me look at your hand a moment.' And there, on his line of fate, was the little cross that means bereavement. It came just right, didn't it, Jacob, when he was 13, for he's 14 this year, and Mrs Luton died just a year ago. Of course I didn't tell Tommy that, for I only told him to wash his hands, but it was most curious. And has your planchette come yet, Mr Georgie? I shall be most anxious to know what it writes, so if you've got an evening free any night soon, just come round for a bit of dinner and we'll make an evening of it, with table turning and planchette and palmistry. Now tell me all about the seance the first night. I wish I could have been present at a real seance, but of course Mrs Quantock can't find room for everybody, and I'm sure it was most kind of her to let the Colonel and me come in yesterday afternoon. We were thrilled with it. And who knows but that the Princess didn't write the Palmer's manual, for on the title page it says by P, and that might be Popoffski as easily as not, or perhaps Princess." This allusion to there not being room for everybody was agony to Lucia. She laughed in her most silvery manner. "Or perhaps Peppino," she said. "I must ask, mio caro, if he wrote it. Or does it stand for Pillson? Georgino, are you the author of the Palmist's manual? Ecco, I believe it was you." This was not quite wise, for no one detested irony more than Mrs Weston, or was sharper to detect it. Lucia should never have been ironical just then, nor, indeed, have dropped into Italian. "No," she said, "I'm sure it was neither il Signor Peppino nor il Signor Pillson who wrote it. I believe it was the Principessa, so ecco. And did we not have a delicious evening at Miss Bracely's the other night? Such lovely singing, and so interesting to learn that Signor Cortese made it all up. And those lovely words, for though I didn't understand much of them, they sounded so exquisite, and fancy Miss Bracely talking Italian so beautifully, when we none of us knew she talked it at all." Mrs Weston's amiable face was crimson with suppressed emotion, of which these few words were only the most insignificant leakage, and a very awkward pause succeeded, which was luckily broken by everybody beginning to talk again very fast and brightly. Then Mrs Weston's chair scudded away, Piggy skipped away to the stocks, where Goosey was sitting with a large sheet of foolscap in case her hand twitched for automatic script, and Lucia turned to Georgie, who alone was left. "Poor Daisy," she said. "I dropped in just now, and really I found her very odd and strange. What with her crazes for Christian Science and uric acid and gurus and mediums, one wonders if she is quite sane. So sad. I should be dreadfully sorry if she had some mental collapse. That sort of thing is always so painful. But I know of a first-rate place for rescuers. I think it would be wise if I just casually dropped the name of it to Mr Robert in case. And this last craze seems so terribly infectious. Fancy Mrs Weston dabbling in palmistry. It is too comical. But I hope I did not hurt her feelings by suggesting that Peppino or you wrote the manual. It is dangerous to make little jokes to poor Mrs Weston." Georgie quite agreed with that, but did not think it necessary to say in what sense he agreed with it. Every day now Lucia was pouring floods of light on a quite new side of her character, which had been undeveloped, like the print from some photographic plate lying in the dark so long as she was undisputed mistress of Riseholme. But so it struck him now, since the advent of Olga, she had taken up a critical, ironical standpoint which previously she had reserved for Londoners. At every turn she had to criticise and condemn, where once she would only have praised. So few months ago there had been that marvellous Hightum garden party, when Olga had sung long after Lady Ambermere had gone away. That was her garden party. The splendour and success of it had been hers, and no one had been allowed to forget that until Olga came back again. But the moment that happened, and Olga began to sing on her own account, which, after all, so Georgie thought, she had a perfect right to do, the whole aspect of affairs was changed. She romped, and Riseholme did not like romps. She sang in church, and that was theatrical. She gave a party with the Spanish quartet, and Brinton was publicly credited with the performance. Then had come Mrs. Quantock and her princess, and, lo, it would be kind to remember the name of an establishment for rest cures, in the hope of saving poor Daisy's sanity. Again Colonel Boucher and Mrs. Weston were intending to get married, and consulted a palmist's manual, so they too helped to develop, as with acid, the print that had lain so long in the dark. "Poor thing," said Lucia. "It is dreadful to have no sense of humour, and I'm sure I hope that Colonel Boucher will thoroughly understand that she has none, before he speaks the fatal words. But then he has none either, and I have often noticed that two people without any sense of humour find each other most witty and amusing. A sense of humour, I expect, is not a very common gift. Miss Bracely has none at all, for I do not call romping humour. As for poor Daisy, what can rival her solemnity in sitting night after night round a table with someone who may or may not be a Russian princess? Russia, of course, is a very large place, and one does not know how many princesses there may be there. And thrilling over a pot of luminous paint and a false nose, and calling it Amadeo, the friend of Dante. This was too much for Georgie. "But you asked Mrs. Quantock and the princess to dine with you," he said, "and hoped there would be a seance afterwards. You wouldn't have done that if you thought it was only a false nose and a pot of luminous paint." "I may have been impulsive," said Lucia, speaking very rapidly. "I dare say I'm impulsive, and if my impulses lie in the direction of extending such poor hospitality as I can offer to my friends and their friends, I am not ashamed of them. Far otherwise. But when I see and observe the awful effect of this so-called spiritualism on people whom I should have thought sensible and well balanced, I do not include poor dear Daisy among them, then I am only thankful that my impulses did not happen to lead me into countenancing such piffle as your sister so truly observed about poor Daisy's guru." They had come opposite Georgie's house, and suddenly his drawing-room window was thrown up. Olga's head looked out. "Don't have a fit, Georgie, to find me here," she said. "Good morning, Mrs. Lucas. You were behind the mulberry and I didn't see you, but something's happened to my kitchen range, and I can't have lunch at home. Do give me some. I've brought my crystal, and we'll gaze and gaze. I can see nothing at present except my own nose and the window. Are you psychical, Mrs. Lucas?" This was the last straw. All Lucia's grievances had been flocking together like swallows for their flight, and to crown all came this open annexation of Georgie. There was Olga sitting in his window all unasked, and demanding lunch, with her silly ridiculous crystal in her hand, wondering if Lucia was psychical. Her silvery laugh was a little shrill. It started a full tone above its normal pitch. "No, dear Miss Bracely," she said, "I'm afraid I am much too commonplace and matter-of-fact to care about such things. It is a great loss, I know, and deprives me of the pleasant society of Russian princesses, but we are all made differently. That is very lucky. I must get home, Georgie." It certainly seemed very lucky that everyone was not precisely like Lucia at that moment, or there would have been quarrelling. She walked quickly off, and Georgie entered his house. Lucia really had been remarkably rude, and if allusion was made to it, he was ready to confess that she seemed a little worried. Friendship would allow that, and candour demanded it, but no allusion of any sort was made. There was a certain flush on Olga's face, and she explained that she had been sitting over the fire. The Princess' visit came to an end next day, and all the world knew that she was going back to London by the 11 a.m. express. Lady Ambermere was quite aware of it, and drove in with Pug and Miss Lyall, meaning to give her a lift to the station, leaving Mrs. Quantock, if she wanted to see her guest off, to follow with the Princess' luggage in the fly, which no doubt had been ordered. But Daisy had no intention of permitting this sort of thing, and drove calmly away with her dear friend in Georgie's motor, leaving the baffled Lady Ambermere to follow or not as she liked. She did like, though not much, and found herself on the platform among a perfect crowd of Riseholmites who had strolled down to the station on this lovely morning to see if parcels had come. Lady Ambermere took very little notice of them, but managed that Pug should give his paw to the Princess as she took her seat, and waved her hand to Mrs. Quantock's dear friend as the train slid out of the station. "The late lord had some Russian relation," she said majestically. "How did you get to know her?" "I met her at Potsdam," was on the tip of Mrs. Quantock's tongue, but she was afraid that Lady Ambermere might not understand, and ask her when she had been to Potsdam. It was grievous work making jokes for Lady Ambermere. The train sped on to London, and the Princess opened the envelope which her hostess had discreetly put in her hand, and found that that was all right. Her hostess had also provided her with an admirable lunch, which her secretary took out of a Gladstone bag. When that was finished, she wanted her cigarettes, and as she looked for these, and even after she had found them, she continued to search for something else. There was the musical box there, and some curious pieces of elastic, and the violin was in its case, and there was a white mask, but still she continued to search. About the same time as she gave up the search, Mrs. Quantock wandered upstairs to the Princess's room. A less highly vitalized nature than hers would have been in a stupor of content, but she was more in a frenzy of content than in a stupor. How fine that frenzy was may be judged from the fact that perhaps the smallest ingredient in it was her utter defeat of Lucia. She cared comparatively little for that glorious achievement, and she was not sure that when the Princess came back again, as she had arranged to do on her next holiday, she would not ask Lucia to come to a seance. Indeed, she had little but pity for the vanquished. So great were the spoils. Never had Riseholme risen to such a pitch of enthusiasm, and with good cause had it done so now. For of all the wonderful and exciting things that had ever happened there, these séances were the most delirious. And better even than the excitement of Riseholme was the cause of its excitement, for spiritualism and the truth of inexplicable psychic phenomena had flashed upon them all. Tableau, romps, yoga, the Moonlight Sonata, Shakespeare, Christian Science, Olga herself, uric acid, Elizabethan furniture, the engagement of Colonel Boucher and Mrs. Weston, all these tremendous topics had paled like fire in the sunlight before the revelation that had now dawned. By practice and patience, by zealous concentration on crystals and palms, by the waiting for automatic script to develop, you attained to the highest mysteries, and could evoke Cardinal Newman or Pocky. There was the bed in which the Sibyl had slept. There was the fresh vase of flowers, difficult to procure in November, but still obtainable, which she loved to have standing near her. There was the chest of drawers in which she had put her clothes, and Mrs. Quantock pulled them open one by one, finding fresh emanations and vibrations everywhere. The lowest one stuck a little, and she had to use force to it. The smile was struck from her face as it flew open. Inside it were billows and billows of the finest possible muslin. Fold after fold of it she drew out, and with it there came a pair of false eyebrows. She recognized them at once as being Amadeo's. The muslin belonged to Pocky as well. She needed but a moment's concentrated thought, and in swift succession rejected two courses of action that suggested themselves. The first was to use the muslin herself. It would make summer garments for years. The chief reason against that was that she was a little old for muslin. The second course was to send the whole paraphernalia back to her dear friend with or without a comment. But that would be tantamount to a direct accusation of fraud. Never any more, if she did that, could she dispense her dear friend to Riseholme like an expensive drug. She would not so utterly burn her boats. There remained only one other judicious course of action, and she got to work. It had been a cold morning, clear and frosty, and she had caused a good fire to be lit in the princess's bedroom for her to dress by. It still prospered in the grate, and Mrs. Quantock, having shut the door and locked it, put on to it the false eyebrows which, as they turned to ash, flew up the chimney. Then she fed it with muslin, yards and yards of muslin she poured on to it. Never had there been so much muslin, nor that so exquisitely fine. It went to her heart to burn it, but there was no time for minor considerations. Every atom of that evidence must be purged by fire. The princess would certainly not write and say that she had left some eyebrows and 100 yards of muslin behind her, for, knowing what she did, it would be to her interests as well as Mrs. Quantock's that those properties should vanish, as if they never had been. Up the chimney in sheets of flame went this delightful fabric. Sometimes it roared there as if it had set the chimney on fire, and she had to pause, shielding her scorched face, until the hollow rumbling had died down. But at last the holocaust was over, and she unlocked the door again. No one knew but she, and no one should ever know. The Guru had turned out to be a curry cook, but no intruding Hermie had been here this time. As long as crystals fascinated and automatic writing flourished, the secret of the muslin and the eyebrows should repose in one bosom alone. Riseholme had been electrified by spiritualism, and even now the seances had been cheap at the price. And in spite of this discovery she felt by no means sure that she would not ask the princess to come again and minister to their spiritual needs. She had hardly got downstairs when Robert came in from the green, where he had been recounting the experience of the last seance. "Looked as if there was a chimney on fire," he said. "I wish it was the kitchen chimney, then perhaps the beef mightn't be so raw as it was yesterday." Thus is comedy intertwined with tragedy. End of chapter. Queen Lucia by E. F. Benson. Read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter 14. Georgie was very busily engaged during the first weeks of December on a water-colour sketch of Olga sitting at her piano and singing. The difficulty of it was such that at times he almost despaired of accomplishing it, for the problem of how to draw her face and her mouth wide open and yet retain the likeness seemed almost insoluble. Often he sat in front of his own looking-glass with his mouth open, and diligently drew his own face in order to arrive at the principles of the changes of line which took place. Certainly the shape of a person's face, when his mouth was wide open, altered so completely that you would have thought him quite unrecognizable, however skilfully the artist reproduced his elongated countenance, and yet Georgie could easily recognize that face in the glass as his. Forehead, eyes, and cheekbones alone retained their wonted aspect. Even the nose seemed to lengthen if you opened your mouth very wide. Then how again was he to indicate that she was singing and not yawning or preparing for a sneeze? His most successful sketch at present looked precisely as if she was yawning, and made Georgie's jaws long to yawn too. Perhaps the shape of the mouth in the two positions was really the same, and it was only the sound that led you to suppose that an open-mouthed person was singing. But perhaps the piano would supply the necessary suggestion. Olga would not sit down at the piano merely to yawn or sneeze, for she could do that anywhere. Then a brilliant idea struck him. He would introduce a shaded lamp standing on the piano, and then her face would be in red shadow. Naturally this entailed fresh problems with regard to light, but light seemed to present less difficulty than likeness. Besides, he could make her dress and the keys of the piano very like indeed. but when he came to painting again he despaired. There must be red shadow on her face and yellow light on her hands and on her green dress, and presently the whole thing looked not so much like Olga singing by lamplight as a lobster salad spread out in the sunlight. The more he painted, the more vividly did the lettuce leaves and the dressing and the lobster emerge from the paper. So he took away the lamp and shut Olga's mouth, and there she would be at her piano, just going to sing. These artistic agonies had rewards which more than compensated for them, for regularly now he took his drawing board and his paint box across to her house and sat with her while she practised. There were none of Love's Lilies Low or Yawning York now, for she was very busy learning her part in Lucretia, spending a solid 2 hours at it every morning. And Georgie began to perceive what sort of work it implied to produce the spontaneous ease with which Brunhilde hailed the sun. More astounding even was the fact that this mere learning of notes was but the preliminary to what she called real work, and when she had got through the mere mechanical part of it she would have to study. Then, when her practice was over, she would indulgently sit with her head in profile against a dark background, and Georgie would suck one end of his brush and bite the other, and wonder whether he would ever produce anything which he could dare to offer her. By daily poring on her face he grew not to admire only, but to adore its youth and beauty. By daily contact with her he began to see how fresh and how lovely was the mind that illuminated it. "Georgie, I'm going to scold you," she said one day, as she took up her place against the black panel. "You're a selfish little brute. You think of nothing but your own amusement. Did that ever strike you?" Georgie gasped with surprise. Here was he spending the whole of every morning trying to do something which would be a worthy Christmas present for her, to say nothing of the hours he spent with his mouth open in front of his glass, and the cost of the beautiful frame which he had ordered, and yet he was supposed to be only thinking about himself. Of course Olga did not know that the picture was to be hers. "How tarsome you are," he said. "You are always finding fault with me. Explain." "Well, you're neglecting your old friends for your new one," she said. "My dear, you should never drop an old friend. For instance, when did you last play duets with Mrs. Lucas?" "Oh, not so very long ago," said Georgie. "Quite long enough, I am sure. But I don't actually mean sitting down and thumping the piano with her. When did you last think about her and make plans for her and talk baby language?" "Who told you I ever did?" asked Georgie. "Gracious, how can I possibly remember that sort of thing? I should say at a guess that everybody told me. Now poor Mrs. Lucas is feeling out of it, and neglected and dethroned. It's all on my mind rather, and I'm talking to you about it because it's largely your fault. Now we're talking quite frankly, so don't fence and say it's mine. I know exactly what you mean, but you are perfectly wrong. Primarily it's Mrs. Lucas' fault, because she's quite the stupidest woman I ever saw, but it's partly your fault too." She turned round. "Come, Georgie, let's have it out," she said. "I'm perfectly powerless to do anything, because she detests me, and you've got to help her and help me and drop your selfishness. Before I came here she used to run you all and give you little treats, like going to her tableau and listening to her stupid old Moonlight Sonata and talking 7 words of Italian, and then I came along with no earthly intention except to enjoy my holidays, and she got it into her head that I was trying to run the place instead of her. Isn't that so? Just say yes." "Yes," said Georgie. "Well, that puts me in an odious position and a helpless position. I did my best to be nice to her. I went to her house until she ceased to ask me, and asked her here for everything that I thought would amuse her until she ceased to come. I took no notice of her rudeness, which was remarkable, or of her absurd patronizing airs, which didn't hurt me in the smallest degree. But, Georgie, she would continue to make such a dreadful ass of herself, and think it was my fault. Was it my fault that she didn't know the Spanish quartet when she heard it? Or that she didn't know a word of Italian when she pretended she did? Or that the other day, it was the last time I saw her, when you played your Debussy to us at Aunt Jane's, she talked to me about inverted fifths? Olga suddenly burst out laughing, and Georgie assumed the Riseholme face of intense curiosity. "You must tell me about that," he said, "and I'll tell you the rest which you don't know." Olga succumbed too, and began to talk in Aunt Jane's voice, for she had adopted her as an aunt. "Well, it was last Monday week," she said, "or was it Sunday? No, it couldn't have been Sunday, because I don't have anybody to tea that day, as Elizabeth goes over to Jacob's and spends the afternoon with Atkinson, or the other way about, which doesn't signify, as the point is that Elizabeth should be free. So it was Monday, and Aunt Jane, it's me talking again, had the tea party at which you played Poisson d'Or. And when it was finished, Mrs Lucas gave a great sigh and said, 'Poor Georgino, wasting his time over that rubbish,' though she knew quite well that I had given it to you. And so I said, 'Would you call it rubbish, do you think?' And she said, 'Quite. Every rule of music is violated. Don't those inverted fifths make you wince, Miss Bracely?'" Olga laughed again, and spoke in her own voice. "Oh, Georgie, she is an ass," she said. "What she meant, I suppose, was consecutive fifths. You can't invert a fifth. So I said, I really meant it as a joke, 'Of course there is that, but you must forgive Debussy that, for the sake of that wonderful passage of submerged tenths.' And she took it quite gravely, and shook her head, and said she was afraid she was a purist. What happened next? That's all I know." "Directly afterwards," said Georgie, "she brought the music to me, and asked me to show her where the passage of tenths came. I didn't know, but I found some tenths, and she brightened up and said, 'Yes, it is true, those submerged tenths are very impressive.' Then I suggested that the submerged tenth was not a musical expression, but referred to a section of the population, on which she said no more, but when she went away she asked me to send her some book on harmony. I dare say she is looking for the submerged tenth still." Olga lit a cigarette and became grave again. "Well, it can't go on," she said. "We can't have the poor thing feeling angry and out of it. Then there was Mrs Quantock absolutely refusing to let her see the Princess." "That was her own fault," said Georgie. "It was because she was so greedy about the Guru." "That makes it all the bitterer. And I can't do anything, because she blames me for it all. I would ask her and Peppino here every night, and listen to her dreary tunes every evening, and let her have it all her own way, if it would do any good. But things have gone too far. She wouldn't come. It has all happened without my noticing it. I never added it all up as it went along, and I hate it." Georgie thought of the spiritualistic truths. "If you're an incarnation," he said, in a sudden glow of admiration, "you're the incarnation of an angel. How you can forgive her odious manners to you—" "My dear, shut up," said Olga. "We've got to do something. Now, how would it be if you gave a nice party on Christmas night, and asked her at once? Ask her to help you in getting it up. Make it clear she's going to run it." "All right. You'll come, won't you?" "Certainly I will not." "Perhaps I will come in after dinner with Goosey, or someone of that sort. Don't you see it would spoil it all if I were at dinner? You must rather pointedly leave me out. Give her a nice, expensive, refined Christmas present too. You might give her that picture you're doing of me. No, I suppose she wouldn't like that. But just comfort her, and make her feel you can't get on without her. You've been her right hand all these years. Make her give her tableau again. And then I think you must ask me in afterwards. I long to see her and Peppino as Brunhilde and Siegfried. Just attend to her, Georgie, and buck her up. Promise me you will. And do it as if your heart was in it, otherwise it's no good." Georgie began packing up his paint box. This was not the plan he had hoped for on Christmas Day, but if Olga wished this, it had got to be done. "Well, I'll do my best," he said. "Thanks ever so much. You're a darling. And how is your planchette getting on? I've been lazy about my crystal, but I get so tired of my own nose." "Planchette would write nothing but a few names," said Georgie, omitting the fact that Olga's was the most frequent. "I think I shall drop it." This was but reasonable, for since Riseholme had some new and absorbing excitement every few weeks, to say nothing of the current excitement of daily life, it followed that even the most thrilling pursuits could not hold the stage for very long. Still, the interest in spiritualism had died down with the rapidity of the seed on stony ground. "Even Mrs. Quantock seems to have cooled," said Olga. "She and her husband were here last night, and they looked rather bored when I suggested table turning. I wonder if anything has happened to put her off it." "What do you think could have?" asked Georgie with Riseholme alacrity. "Georgie, do you really believe in the Princess and Pocky?" she asked. Georgie looked round to see that there was no one within hearing. "I did at the time," he said. "At least I think I did, but it seems less likely now. Who was the Princess anyway? Why didn't we ever hear of her before? I believe Mrs. Quantock met her in the train or something." "So do I," said Olga, "but not a word. It makes Aunt Jane and Uncle Jacob completely happy to believe in it all. Their lines of life are enormous, and they won't die till they're over 100. Now go and see Mrs. Lucas, and if she doesn't ask you to lunch, you can come back here." Georgie put down his picture and painting apparatus at his house, and went on to Lucia's, definitely conscious that though he did not want to have her to dinner on Christmas Day, or go back to his duets and his ADC duties, there was a spice and savour in so doing that came entirely from the fact that Olga wished him to, that by this service he was pleasing her. In itself it was distasteful, in itself it tended to cut him off from her if he had to devote his time to Lucia, but he still delighted in doing it. "I believe I'm falling in love with her this time," said Georgie to himself. "She's wonderful, she's big, she's—" At that moment his thoughts were violently diverted, for Robert Quantock came out of his house in a tremendous hurry, merely scowling at Georgie, and positively trotted across the green in the direction of the newsagent's. Instantly Georgie recollected that he had seen him there already this morning before his visit to Olga, buying a new twopenny paper in a yellow cover called Todd's News. They had had a few words of genial conversation, and what could have happened in the last 2 hours that made Robert merely gnash his teeth at Georgie now, and make a second visit to the paper shop? It was impossible not to linger a moment and see what Robert did when he got to the paper shop, and with the aid of his spectacles Georgie perceived that he presently loaded himself with a whole packet of newspapers in yellow covers, presumably Todd's News. Flesh and blood could not resist the cravings of curiosity, and making a detour so as to avoid being gnashed at again by Robert, who was coming rapidly back in his direction, he strolled round to the paper shop and asked for a copy of Todd's News. Instantly the bright December morning grew dark with mystery, for the proprietor told him that Mr. Quantock had bought every copy he possessed of it. No further information could be obtained, except that he had bought a copy of every other daily paper as well. Georgie could make nothing of it whatever, and having observed Robert hurry into his house again, went on his errand to Lucia. Had he seen what Robert did when he got home, it is doubtful if he could have avoided breaking into the house and snatching a copy of Todd's News from him. Robert went to his study and locked the door. He drew out from under his blotting pad the first copy of Todd's News that he bought earlier in the morning, and put it with the rest. Then, with a furrowed brow, he turned to the police reports in the Times, and after looking at them, laid the paper down. He did the same to the Daily Telegraph, the Daily Mail, the Morning Post, the Daily Chronicle. Finally, this was the last of the daily papers, he perused the Daily Mirror, tore it in shreds, and said, "Damn!" He sat for a while in thought, trying to recollect if anybody in Riseholme except Colonel Boucher took in the Daily Mirror. But he felt morally certain that no one did, and letting himself out of his study and again locking the door after him, he went into the street and saw at a glance that the Colonel was employed in whirling Mrs. Weston round the green. Instead of joining them, he hurried to the Colonel's house and, for there was no time for half measures, fixed Atkinson with his eye and said he would like to write a note to Colonel Boucher. He was shown into his sitting room and saw the Daily Mirror lying open on the table. As soon as he was left alone, he stuffed it into his pocket, told Atkinson he would speak to the Colonel instead, and intercepted the path of the bath chair. He was nearly run over, but stood his ground, and in a perfectly firm voice asked the Colonel if there was any news in the morning papers. With the Colonel's decided negative ringing joyfully in his ears, he went home again, and locked himself for the second time into his study. There is a luxury when some fell danger has been averted by promptness and presence of mind, in living through the moments of that danger again, and Robert opened Todd's News, for that gave the fuller account, and read over the paragraph in the police news headed "Bogus Russian Princess." But now he gloated over the lines which had made him shudder before, when he read how Marie Lowenstein, of 15 Gerald Street, Charing Cross Road, calling herself Princess Popoffski, had been brought up at the Bow Street Police Court for fraudulently professing to tell fortunes and produce materialized spirits at a seance in her flat. Sordid details followed. A detective who had been there seized an apparition by the throat and turned on the electric light. It was the woman Popoffski's throat that he held, and her secretary, Hezekiah Schwartz, was discovered under the table detaching an electric hammer. A fine was inflicted. A moment's mental debate was sufficient to determine Robert not to tell his wife. It was true that she had produced Popoffski, but then he had praised and applauded her for that. He, no less than she, had been convinced of Popoffski's integrity, high rank, and marvellous psychic powers. And together they had soared to a pinnacle of unexampled greatness in the Riseholme world. Besides, poor Daisy would be simply flattened out if she knew that Popoffski was no better than the guru. He glanced at the pile of papers and at the fireplace. It had been a cold morning, clear and frosty, and a good blaze prospered in the grate. Out of each copy of Todd's News he tore the page on which were printed the police reports, and fed the fire with them. Page after page he put upon it. Never had so much paper been devoted to one grate. Up the chimney they flew in sheets of flame. Sometimes he was afraid he had set it on fire, and he had to pause, shielding his scorched face, until the hollow rumbling had died down. With the page from 2 copies of the Daily Mirror, the holocaust was over, and he unlocked the door again. No one in Riseholme knew but he, and no one should ever know. Riseholme had been electrified by spiritualism, and even now the seances had been cheap at the price. The debris of all these papers he caused to be removed by the housemaid, and this was hardly done when his wife came in from the green. "I thought there was a chimney on fire, Robert," she said. "You would have liked it to be the kitchen chimney, as you said the other day." "Stuff and nonsense, my dear," said he. "Lunch time, isn't it?" "Yes. Ah, there's the post. None for me and 2 for you." She looked at him narrowly as he took his letters. Perhaps their subconscious minds, according to her dear friend's theory, held communication, but only the faintest unintelligible ripple of that appeared on the surface. "I haven't heard from my princess since she went away," she remarked. Robert gave a slight start. He was a little off his guard from the reaction after his anxiety. "Indeed," he said. "Have you written to her?" She appeared to try to remember. "Well, I really don't believe I have," she said. "That is remiss of me. I must send her a long budget one of these days." This time he looked narrowly at her. Had she a secret, he wondered, as well as he? What could it be? Georgie found his mission none too easy, and it was only the thought that it was a labour of love, or something very like it, that enabled him to persevere. Even then, for the first few minutes, he thought it might prove love's labours lost, so bright and unreal was Lucia. He had half-crossed Shakespeare's garden, and had clearly seen her standing at the window of the music-room, when she stole away, and next moment the strains of some slow movement, played very loud, drowned the bell on the mermaid's tail so completely that he wondered whether it had rung at all. As a matter of fact, Lucia and Peppino were in the midst of a most serious conversation when Georgie came through the gate, which was concerned with deciding what was to be done. A party at the Hurst, some time during Christmas week, was as regular as the festival itself, but this year everything was so unusual. Who were to be asked in the first place? Certainly not Mrs. Weston, for she had talked Italian to Lucia in a manner impossible to misinterpret. And probably, so said Lucia with great acidity, she would be playing children's games with her promesso. It was equally impossible to ask Miss Bracely and her husband, for relations were already severed on account of the Spanish quartet and Signor Cortese. And as for the Quantocks, did Peppino expect Lucia to ask Mrs. Quantock ever again? Then there was Georgie, who had become so different and strange, and well, here was Georgie. Hastily she sat down at the piano, and Peppino closed his eyes for the slow movement. The opening of the door was lost on Lucia, and Peppino's eyes were closed. Consequently, Georgie sat down on the nearest chair and waited. At the end, Peppino sighed, and he sighed too. "Who is that?" said Lucia sharply. "Why is it you, Georgie? What a stranger, aren't you? Any news?" This was all delivered in the coldest of tones, and Lucia snatched a morsel of wax off Eb. "I've heard none," said Georgie in great discomfort. "I just dropped in." Lucia fixed Peppino with a glance. If she had shouted at the top of her voice, she could not have conveyed more unmistakably that she was going to manage this situation. "Ah, that is very pleasant," she said. "Peppino and I have been so busy lately that we have seen nobody. We are quite country cousins, and so the town mouse must spare us a little cheese. How is dear Miss Bracely now?" "Very well," said Georgie. "I saw her this morning." Lucia gave a sigh of relief. "That is good," she said. "Peppino, do you hear Miss Bracely is quite well? Not overtired with practising that new opera? Lucy Grecian, was it? Oh, how silly I am. Lucretia, that was it, by that extraordinary Neapolitan. Yes, and what next? Our good Mrs. Weston, now, still thinking about her nice young man? Making orange flower wreaths and choosing bridesmaids? How naughty I am! Yes, and then dear Daisy, how is she? Still entertaining princesses? I look in the court circular every morning to see if Princess Popoff, isn't it? Princess Popoff has popped off to see her cousin the Tsar again. Dear me!" The amount of malice, envy, and all uncharitableness which Lucia managed to put into this quite unrehearsed speech was positively amazing. She had not thought it over beforehand for a moment. It came out with the august spontaneity of lightning leaping from a cloud. Not till that moment had Georgie guessed at a tithe of all that Olga had felt so certain about, and a double emotion took hold of him. He was immensely sorry for Lucia, never having conjectured how she must have suffered before she attained to so superb a sourness, and he adored the intuition that had guessed it and wanted to sweeten it. The outburst was not quite over yet, though Lucia felt distinctly better. "And you, Georgie," she said, "though I'm sure we are such strangers that I ought to call you Mr. Pillson, what have you been doing? Playing Miss Bracely's accompaniments and sewing wedding dresses all day and raising spooks all night, yes?" Lucia had caught this "yes" from Lady Ambermere, having found it peculiarly obnoxious. You laid down a proposition or asked a question, and then confirmed it yourself. "And Mr. Cortese," she said, "is he still roaring out his marvellous English and Italian? Yes, what a full life you lead, Georgie. I suppose you have no time for your painting now." This was not a bow drawn at a venture, for she had seen Georgie coming out of Old Place with his paint box and drawing board, but this direct attack on him did not lessen the power of the sweet charity which had sent him here. He blew the bugle to rally all the good nature for which he was capable. "No, I have been painting lately," he said. "At least I've been trying to. I'm doing a sketch of Miss Bracely at her piano, which I want to give her on Christmas Day. But it's so difficult. I wish I had brought it round to ask your advice, but you would only have screamed with laughter at it. It's a dreadful failure, much worse than those I gave you for your birthdays. Fancy you keeping them still in your lovely music room. Send them to the pantry, and I'll do something better for you next." Lucia, try as she might, could not help being rather touched by that. There they all were, golden autumn woodland, bleak December, yellow daffodils, and roses of summer. "Or have them blacked over by the boot boy," she said. "Take them down, Georgie, and let me send them to be blacked." This was much better. There was playfulness behind the sarcasm now, which peeped out from it. He made the most of that. "We'll do that presently," he said. "Just now I want to engage you and Peppino to dine with me on Christmas Day. Now don't be tarsome and say you're engaged, but one can never tell with you." "A party?" asked Lucia suspiciously. "Well, I thought we could just have one of our old evenings together again," said Georgie, feeling himself remarkably clever. "We'll have the Quantocks, shan't we, and Colonel and Mrs Colonel, and you and Peppino and me and Mrs Rumbold. That'll make 8, which is more than Foljambe likes, but she must lump it. Mr Rumbold is always singing carols all Christmas evening with the choir, and she will be alone." "Ah, those carols," said Lucia, wincing. "I know. I will provide you with little wads of cotton wool. Do come, and we'll have just a party of 8. I've asked no one yet, and perhaps nobody will come. I want you and Peppino, and the rest may come or stop away. Do say you approve." Lucia could not yield at once. She had to press her fingers to her forehead. "So kind of you, Georgie," she said, "but I must think. Are we doing anything on Christmas night, carissimo? Where's your engagement book? Go and consult it." This was a grand manoeuvre, for hardly had Peppino left the room when she started up with a little scream and ran after him. "Me so stupid," she cried. "Me put it in smoking room, and poor Caro will look for it ever so long. Back in a minute, Georgino." Naturally this was perfectly clear to Georgie. She wanted to have a short private consultation with Peppino, and he waited rather hopefully for their return, for Peppino, he felt sure, was bored with this Achilles attitude of sitting sulking in the tent. They came back wreathed in smiles, and instantly embarked on the question of what to do after dinner. No romps, certainly not, but why not the tableau again? The question was still under debate when they went in to lunch. It was settled affirmatively during the macaroni, and Lucia said that they all wanted to work her to death and so get rid of her. They had thought, she and Peppino, of having a little holiday on the Riviera, but anyhow they would put it off till after Christmas. George's mouth was full of crashing toast at the moment, and he could only shake his head, but as soon as the toast could be swallowed he made the usual reply with great fervour. Georgie was hardly at all complacent when he walked home afterwards, and thought how extremely good-natured he had been, for he could not but feel that this marvellous forbearance was a sort of mistletoe growth on him, quite foreign really to his nature. Never before had Lucia showed so shrewish and venomous a temper. He had not thought her capable of it. For the gracious Queen there was substituted a snarling fishwife. But then, as Georgie calmly pursued the pacific mission of comfort to which Olga had ordained him, how the fishwife's wrinkles had been smoothed out, and the asps withered from her tongue. Had his imagination ever pictured Lucia saying such things to him, it would have supplied him with no sequel but a complete severance of relations between them. Instead of that, he had consulted her and truckled her. Truckled, yes, he had truckled, and he was astonished at himself. Why had he truckled? And the beautiful mouth and kindly eyes of Olga supplied the answer. Certainly he must drop in at once and tell her the result of the mission. Perhaps she would reward him by calling him a darling again. Really he deserved that she should say something nice to him. It was a day of surprises for Georgie. He found Olga at home, and recounted, without loving any of the substance, the sarcasms of Lucia, and his own amazing tact and forbearance. He did not comment, he just narrated the facts in a vivid Riseholme manner, and waited for his reward. Olga looked at him a moment in silence, then she deliberately wiped her eyes. "Oh, poor Mrs Lucas," she said. "She must have been miserable to have behaved like that. I'm so sorry. Now, what else can you do, Georgie, to make her feel better?" "I think I've done everything that could have been required of me," said Georgie. "It was all I could do to keep my temper at all. I will give my party at Christmas because I promised you I would." "Oh, but it's 10 days to Christmas yet," said Olga. "Can't you paint her portrait and give it her for a present?" "Oh, I think you could, playing the Moonlight Sonata." Georgie felt terribly inclined to be offended, and to tell Olga that she was tired of him, or to be dignified and say he was unusually busy. Never had he shown such forbearance towards downright rudeness as he had shown to Lucia, and though he had shown that for Olga's sake, she seemed to be without a single spark of gratitude, but continued to urge her request. "Do paint a little picture of her," she repeated. "She would love it, and make it young and interesting. Think over it anyhow. Perhaps you'll think of something better than that. And now won't you go and secure all your guests for Christmas at once?" Georgie turned to leave the room, but just as he got to the door she spoke again. "I think you're a brick," she said. Somehow this undemonstrative expression of approval began to glow in Georgie's heart as he walked home. Apparently she took it for granted that he was going to behave with all the perfect tact and good temper that he had shown. It did not surprise her in the least. She had almost forgotten to indicate that she had noticed it at all, and that, as he thought about it, seemed a far deeper compliment than if she had told him how wonderful he was. She took it for granted, no more nor less, that he would be kind and pleasant, whatever Lucia said. He had not fallen short of her standard. End of chapter. Queen Lucia by E. F. Benson. Read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter 15. George's Christmas party had just taken its seat at his round rosewood table without a cloth, and he hoped that Foljambe would be quick with the champagne, because there had been rather a long wait before dinner, owing to Lucia and Peppino being late, and conversation had been a little jerky. Lucia, as usual, had sailed into the room without a word of apology, for she was accustomed to coming last when she went out to dinner, and on her arrival dinner was always announced immediately. The few seconds that intervened were employed by her in saying just one kind word to everybody. Tonight, however, these gratifying utterances had not been received with the gratified responses to which she was accustomed. There was a different atmosphere abroad, and it was as if she were no more than 1/8 of the entire party. But it would never do to hurry Foljambe, who was a little upset already by the fact of there being 8 to dinner, which was 2 more than she approved of. Lucia was on George's right, Mrs. Colonel, as she had decided to call herself, on his left. Next her was Peppino, then Mrs. Quantock, then the Colonel, then Mrs. Rumbold, who resembled a grey, hungry mouse, and Mr. Quantock completed the circle round to Lucia again. Everyone had a small bunch of violets in the napkin, but Lucia had the largest. She had also a footstool. "Capital good soup," remarked Mr. Quantock. "Can't get soup like this at home." There was dead silence. Why was there never a silence when Olga was there, wondered Georgie. It wasn't because she talked. She somehow caused other people to talk. "Tommy Luton hasn't got measles," said Mrs. Weston. "I always said he hadn't, though there are measles about. He came to walk as usual this morning, and is going to sing in the carols tonight." She suddenly stopped. Georgie gave an imploring glance at Foljambe, and looked at the champagne glasses. She took no notice. Lucia turned to Georgie with an elbow on the table between her and Mr. Quantock. "And what news, Georgie?" she said. "Peppino and I have been so busy that we haven't seen a soul all day. What have you been doing? Any planchette?" She looked brightly at Mrs. Quantock. "Yes, dear Daisy, I needn't ask you what you've been doing. Table turning, I expect. I know how interested you are in psychical matters. I should be too, if only I could be certain that I was not dealing with fraudulent people." Georgie felt inclined to give a hollow groan and sink under the table when this awful polemical rhetoric began. To his unbounded surprise, Mrs. Quantock answered most cordially. "You are quite right, dear Lucia," she said. "Would it not be terrible to find that a medium, some dear friend perhaps whom one implicitly trusted, was exposed as fraudulent? One sees such exposures in the paper sometimes. I should be miserable if I thought I had ever sat with a medium who was not honest. They fine the wretches well, though, if they are caught, and they deserve it." Georgie observed, and couldn't the least understand, a sudden blank expression cross Robert's face. For the moment he looked as if he were dead, but had been beautifully stuffed. But Georgie gave but a cursory thought to that, for the amazing supposition dawned on him that Lucia had not been polemical at all, but was burying instead of chopping with the hatchet. It was instantly confirmed, for Lucia took her elbow off the table and turned to Robert. "You and dear Daisy have been very lucky in your spiritualistic experiences," she said. "I hear on all sides what a charming medium you had. Georgie quite lost his heart to her." "'Pon my word, she was delightful," said Robert. "Of course she was a dear friend of Daisy's, but one has to be very careful when one hears of the dreadful exposures, as my wife said, that occur sometimes. Fancy finding that a medium whom you believe to be perfectly honest had yards and yards of muslin and a false nose or two concealed about it. It would sicken me of the whole business." A loud pop announced that Foljambe had allowed them all some champagne at last, but Georgie hardly heard it, for, glancing up at Daisy Quantock, he observed that the same dead and stuffed look had come over her face which he had just now noticed on her husband's countenance. Then they both looked up at each other with a glance that to him bristled with significance. An agonized questioning and imploring petition for silence seemed to inspire it. It was as if each had made unwittingly some hopeless faux pas. Then they instantly looked away from each other again. Their necks seemed to crack with the rapidity with which they turned them right and left, and they burst into torrents of speech to the grey, hungry mouse and the Colonel, respectively. Georgie was utterly mystified. His Riseholme instinct told him that there was something below all this, but his Riseholme instinct could not supply the faintest clue as to what it was. Both of the Quantocks, it seemed clear, knew something perilous about the Princess. But surely if Daisy had read in the paper that the Princess had been exposed and fined, she would not have touched on so dangerous a subject. Then the curious incident about Todd's news inevitably occurred to him. But that would not fit the case, since it was Robert and not Daisy who had bought that inexplicable number of the yellow print. And then Robert had hinted at the discovery of yards and yards of muslin and a false nose. Why had he done that unless he had discovered them? Or unless... Georgie's eyes grew round with the excitement of the chase. Unless Robert had some other reason to suspect the integrity of the dear friend, and had said this at haphazard. In that case, what was Robert's reason for suspicion? Had he, not Daisy, read in the paper of some damaging disclosures, and had Daisy, also having reason to suspect the Princess, alluded to the damaging exposures in the paper by pure haphazard? Anyhow, they had both looked dead and stuffed when the other alluded to mediumistic frauds, and both had said how lucky their own experiences had been. Oh, Georgie almost said it out loud. What if Robert had seen a damaging exposure in Todd's news, and therefore bought up every copy that was to be had? Then, indeed, he would look dead and stuffed when Daisy alluded to damaging exposures in the paper. Had a stray copy escaped him, and did Daisy know? What did Robert know? Had they exquisite secrets from each other? Lucia was being talked to across him by Mrs. Weston, who had also pinned down the attention of Peppino on the other side of her. At that precise moment the flood of Mrs. Quantock's spate of conversation to the Colonel dried up, and Robert could find nothing more to say to the hungry mouse. Georgie, in this backwater of his own thoughts, was whirled into the current again, but before he sank he caught Mrs. Quantock's eye and put a question that arose from his exciting backwater. "Have you heard from the Princess lately?" he asked. Robert's head went round with the same alacrity as he had turned it away. "Oh, yes," said she. 2 days ago, was it, Robert?" "I heard yesterday," said Robert firmly. Mrs. Quantock looked at her husband with an eager, encouraging earnestness. "So you did," she said. "I'm getting jealous. Interesting, dear?" "Yes, dear. Oh," said Robert, and again their eyes met. This time Georgie had no doubts at all. They were playing the same game now. They smiled and smirked at each other. They had not been playing the same game before. Now they recognized that there was a conspiracy between them. But he was host, his business for the moment was to make his guests comfortable, and not pry into their inmost bosoms. So before Mrs. Weston realized that she had the whole table attending to her, he said, "I shall get it out of Robert after dinner, and I'll tell you, Mrs. Quantock." "Before Atkinson came to the Colonel," said Mrs. Weston, going on precisely where she had left off, "and that was 5 years before Elizabeth came to me. Let me see, was it 5 or was it 4.5? 4.5, we'll say. He had another servant whose name was Ahab Crowe." "No," said Georgie. "Yes," said Mrs. Weston, hastily finishing her champagne, for she saw Foljambe coming near. "Yes, Ahab Crowe. He married too, just like Atkinson is going to. And that's an odd coincidence in itself. I tell the Colonel that if Ahab Crowe hadn't married, he would be with him still, and who can say that he'd have fancied Elizabeth? And if he hadn't, I don't believe that the Colonel and I would ever have... Well, I'll leave that alone and spare my blushes. But that's not what I was saying. Whom do you think Ahab Crowe married? You can have 10 guesses each, and you would never come right, for it can't be a common name. It was Miss Jackdaw. Crowe, Jackdaw. I never heard anything like that. And if you ask the Colonel about it, he'll confirm every word I've said. Boucher, Weston. Why, that's quite commonplace in comparison. And I'm sure that's an event enough for me." Lucia gave her silvery laugh. "Dear Mrs. Weston," she said, "you must really tell me at once when the happy day will be. Peppino and I are thinking of going to the Riviera." Georgie broke in. "You shan't do anything of the kind," he said. "What's to happen to us? Ooh, very selfish, Lucia." The conversation broke up again into duets and trios, and Lucia could have a private conversation with her host. But half an hour ago, so Georgie reflected, they had all been walking around each other like dogs, going on tiptoe with their tails very tightly curled and growling gently to themselves, aware that a hasty snap or the breach of the smallest observance of etiquette might lead to a general quarrel. But now they all had the reward of their icy politeness. There was no more ice except on their plates, and the politeness was not a matter of etiquette. At present they might be considered a republic, but no one knew what was going to happen after dinner. Not a word had been said about the tableau. Lucia dropped her voice as she spoke to him, and put in a good deal of Italian for fear she might be overheard. "No conosce anybody?" she asked. "I tablieri, I mean. And are we all to sit in the aula while the salone is being got ready?" "Sì," said Georgie. "There's a fire. When you go out, keep them there. I domestichi are making salone ready." "Molto bene. Then Peppino and you and I just steal away. La lampa is acting beautifully. We tried it over several times." "Everybody's tumming," said Georgie, varying the cipher. "Mi so nervosa," said Lucia. "Fancy me doing Brunhilde before singing Brunhilde. Me can't bear it." Georgie knew that Lucia had been thrilled and delighted to know that Olga so much wanted to come in after dinner and see the tableau, so he found it quite easy to induce Lucia to nerve herself up to an ordeal so passionately desired. Indeed, he himself was hardly less excited at the thought of being King Cophetua. At that moment, even as the crackers were being handed round, the sound of the carol singers was heard from outside, and Lucia had to wince as good King Wenceslas looked out. When the page and the king sang their speeches, the other voices grew piano, so that the effect was of a solo voice accompanied. When the page sang, Lucia shuddered. "That's the small red-haired boy who nearly deafens me in church," she whispered to Georgie. "Don't you hope his voice will crack soon?" She said this very discreetly, so as not to hurt Mrs. Rumbold's feelings, for she trained the choir. Everyone knew that the king was Mr. Rumbold, and said "charming" to each other after he had sung. "I like that boy's voice too," said Mrs. Weston. "Tommy Luton used to have a lovely voice, but this one struck me as better trained even than Tommy Luton's. Great credit to you, Mrs. Rumbold." The grey hungry mouse suddenly gave a shrill cackle of a laugh. quite inexplicable. Then Georgie guessed. He got up. "Now, nobody must move," he said, "because we haven't drunk absent friends yet. I'm just going out to see that they have a bit of supper in the kitchen before they go on." His trembling legs would scarcely carry him to the door, and he ran out. There were half a dozen little choir boys, 4 men and 1 tall cloaked woman. "Divine," he said to Olga. "Aunt Jane thought your voice very well trained. Come in soon, won't you?" "Yes, all flourishing?" "Swimming," said Georgie. "Lucia hoped your voice would crack soon, but it's all being lovely." He explained about the food in the kitchen and hurried back to his guests. There was the riddle of the Quantocks to solve, there were the tableaux vivants imminent, and there was the little red-haired boy coming in soon. What a Christmas night! Soon after, Georgie's hall began to fill up with guests, and yet not a word was said about tableaux. It grew so full that nobody could have said for certain whether Lucia and Peppino were there or not. Olga certainly was, there was no mistaking that fact, and then Foljambe opened the drawing-room door and sounded a gong. The lamp behaved perfectly, and an hour later one Brunhilde was being extremely kind to the other as they sat together. "If you really want to know my view, dear Miss Bracely," said Lucia, "it's just that. You must be Brunhilde for the time being. Singing, of course, as you say, helps it out. But you can express so much by singing. You are so lucky there. I'm bound to say I had qualms when Peppino, or was it Georgie, suggested we should do Brunhilde Siegfried. I said it would be so terribly difficult. Slow, it has to be slow, and to keep gestures slow when you cannot make them mere illustrations of what you're singing. Well, I'm sure it's very kind of you to be so flattering about it, but it is difficult to do that." "And you thought them all out for yourself," said Olga. "Marvellous." "Ah, if I had ever seen you do it," said Lucia, "I am sure I should have picked up some hints. And King Cophetua, won't you give me a little word for our dear King Cophetua? I was so glad after the strain of Brunhilde to have my back to the audience. Even then there is the difficulty of keeping quite still, but I am sure you know that quite as well as I do, from having played Brunhilde yourself. Georgie was very much impressed by your performance of it. And Mary Queen of Scots now, the shrinking of the flesh and the resignation of the spirit, that's what I tried to express. You must come and help me next time I attempt this sort of thing again. That will not be quite soon, I'm afraid, for Peppino and I are thinking of going to the Riviera for a little holiday." "Oh, but how selfish," said Olga. "You mustn't do that." Lucia gave the silvery laugh. "You're all very tiresome about my going to the Riviera," she said, "but I don't promise that I shall give it up yet. We shall see. Gracious, how late it is! We must have sat very late over dinner. Why were you not asked to dinner, I wonder? I shall scold Georgie for not asking you. Ah, there is dear Mrs Weston going away. I must say good night to her. She would think it very strange if I did not. Colonel Boucher too. Oh, they're coming this way to save us the trouble of moving." A general move was certainly taking place, not in the direction of the door, but to where Olga and Lucia were sitting. "It's snowing," said Piggy excitedly to Olga. "Will you mark my footsteps well, my page?" "Piggy, you goosey," said Olga hurriedly. "Goosey, weren't the tableaux lovely?" "And the carols," said Goosey. "I adored the carols. I guessed. Did you guess, Mrs Lucas?" Olga resorted to the mean trick of treading on Goosey's foot and apologizing. That was cowardly, because it was sure to come out some time. And Goosey again trod on dangerous ground by saying that if the page had trod like that, there was no need for any footsteps to be marked for him. It was snowing fast, and Mrs Weston's wheels left a deep track, but in spite of that, Daisy and Robert had not gone 50 yards from the door when they came to a full stop. "Now, what is it?" said Daisy. "Out with it. Why did you talk about the discovery of muslin?" "I only said that we were fortunate in a medium whom, after all, you picked up at a vegetarian restaurant," said he. "I suppose I may indulge in general conversation. If it comes to that, why did you talk about exposure in the papers?" "General conversation," said Mrs Quantock, all in one word. "So that's all, is it?" "Yes," said Robert, "you may know something, and—" "Now don't put it all on me," said Daisy. "If you want to know what I think, it's that you've got some secret." "And if you want to know what I think," he retorted, "it is that I know you have." Daisy hesitated a moment. The snow was white on her shoulder, and she shook her cloak. "I hate concealment," she said. "I found yards and yards of muslin and a pair of Amadeo's eyebrows in that woman's bedroom the very day she went away." "And she was fined last Thursday for holding a seance at which a detective was present," said Robert. 15 Gerrard Street. He seized Amadeo or Cardinal Newman by the throat, and it was that woman." She looked hastily round. "When you thought the chimney was on fire, I was burning muslin," she said. "When you thought the chimney was on fire, I was burning every copy of Todd's News," said he. "Also a copy of the Daily Mirror, which contained the case. It belonged to the Colonel. I stole it." She put her hand through his arm. "Let's get home," she said. "We must talk it over. No one knows one word except you and me?" "Not one, my dear," said Robert cordially. "But there are suspicions. Georgie suspects, for instance. He saw me buy all the copies of Todd's News. At least he was hanging about. Tonight he was clearly on the track of something, though he gave us a very tolerable dinner." They went into Robert's study. It was cold, but neither felt it, for they glowed with excitement and enterprise. "That was a wonderful stroke of yours, Robert," she said. "It was masterly. It saved the situation. The Daily Mirror, too. How right you were to steal it. A horrid paper, I always thought." "Yes, Georgie suspects something, but luckily he doesn't know what he suspects." "That's why we both said we had just heard from that woman," said Robert. "Of course. You haven't got a copy of Todd's News, have you?" "No. At least I burned every page of the police reports," said he. "It was safer." "Quite so. I cannot show you Amadeo's eyebrows for the same reason, nor the muslin." "Lovely muslin, my dear. Yards of it. Now, what we must do is this. We must continue to be interested in psychical things. We mustn't drop them or seem to be put off them. I wish now I had taken you into my confidence at the beginning and told you about Amadeo's eyebrows." "My dear, you acted for the best," said he. "So did I when I didn't tell you about Todd's News. Secrecy even from each other was more prudent until it became impossible. And I think we should be wise to let it be understood that we hear from the Princess now and then. Perhaps in a few months she might even visit us again. It would be humorous to be behind the scenes, so to speak, and observe the credulity of the others." Daisy broke into a broad grin. "I will certainly ask dear Lucia to a seance if we do," she said. "Dear me, how late it is. There was such a long wait between the tableaux. But we must keep our eyes on Georgie, and be careful how we answer his impertinent questions. He's sure to ask some about getting that woman down again, Robert. It might be foolhardy, for we've had an escape, and shouldn't put our heads in the same noose again. On the other hand, it would disarm suspicion forever if, after a few months, I asked her to spend a few days of holiday here. You said it was a fine only, not imprisonment." The week was a busy one. Georgie, in particular, never had a moment to himself. The Hurst, so lately a desert, suddenly began to rejoice with joy and singing, and broke out into all manner of edifying gaieties. Lucia, capricious queen, quite forgot all the vitriolic things she had said to him, and gave him to understand that he was just as high in favour as ever before, and he was as busy with his duties as ever he had been. Whether he would have fallen into his old place so readily if he had been a free agent was a question that did not arise, for though it was Lucia who employed him, it was Olga who drove him there. But he had his consolation, for Lucia's noble forgiveness of all the disloyalties against her included Olga's as well, and out of all the dinners and music parties, and recitations from Peppino's new book of prose poems, which was already in proof, and was read to select audiences from end to end, there was none to which Olga was not bidden, and none at which she failed to appear. Lucia even overlooked the fact that she had sung in the carols on Christmas night, though she had herself declared that it was the voice of the red-haired boy which was so peculiarly painful to her. Georgie's picture of her, she never knew that Olga had really commissioned it, hung at the side of the piano in the music room, where the print of Beethoven had hung before, and it gave her the acutest gratification. It represented her sitting with eyes cast down at her piano, and was indeed much on the same scheme as the yet unfinished one of Olga, which had been postponed in its favour. But there was no time for Georgie to think out another position, and his hand was in with regard to the perspective of pianos. So there it hung with its title, The Moonlight Sonata, painted in gilt letters on its frame, and Lucia, though she continued to say that he had made her far, far too young, could not but consider that he had caught her expression exactly. So Riseholme flocked back to the Hurst like sheep that have been turned astray, for it was certain to find Olga there, even as it had turned there, deeply breathing to the classes of the Guru. It had to sit through the prose poems of Peppino, it had to listen to the old tunes and sigh at the end, but Olga mingled her sighs with theirs, and often after a suitable pause Lucia would say winningly to Olga, "One little song, Miss Bracely, just a stanza, or am I trespassing too much on your good nature? Where is your accompanist? I declare I am jealous of him. I shall pop into his place some day. Georgino, Miss Bracely is going to sing us something. Is not that a treat? Shh, please, ladies and gentlemen." And she rustled to her place and sat with the farthest away expression ever seen on mortal face, while she trespassed on Miss Bracely's good nature. Then Georgie had the other picture to finish, which he hoped to get ready in time to be a New Year's present, since Olga had insisted on Lucia's being done first. He had certainly secured an admirable likeness of her, and there was in it just all that his stippled fuzzy representation of Lucia lacked. Bleak December and yellow daffodils, and the rest of the series lacked it too. For once he had done something in the doing of which he had forgotten himself. It was by no means a work of genius, for Georgie was not possessed of one grain of that, and the talent it displayed was by no means of a high order, but it had something of the naturalness of a flower that grew from the earth which nourished it. On the last day of the year he was putting a few final touches to it, little high reflected lights on the black keys, little blacknesses of shadow in the moulding of the panel behind his hand. He had finished with her altogether, and now she sat in the window seat, looking out and playing with the blind tassel. He had been so much absorbed in his work that he had scarcely noticed that she had been rather unusually silent. "I've got a piece of news for you," she said at length. Georgie held his breath, as he drew a very thin line of body colour along the edge of Ab. "No, what is it?" he said. "Is it about the Princess?" Olga seemed to hail this as a diversion. "Let's talk about that for a minute," she said. "What you ought to have done was to order another copy of Todd's News at once." "I know I ought, but I couldn't get one when I thought of it afterwards. That was tarsome, but I feel sure there was something about her in it." "And you can't get anything out of the Quantocks?" "No, though I've laid plenty of traps for them. There's an understanding between them now. They both know something. When I lay a trap it isn't any use. They look at the trap, and then they look at each other afterwards." "What sort of traps?" "Oh, anything. I say suddenly, what a bore it is that there are so many frauds among mediums, especially paid ones. You see, I don't believe for a moment that these seances were held for nothing, though we didn't pay for going to them. And then Robert says that he would never trust a paid medium, and she looks at him approvingly and says, 'Dear Princess.' The other day, it was a very good trap, I said, 'Is it true that the Princess is coming to stay with Lady Ambermere?' It wasn't a lie, I only asked. And then," said Olga, "Robert gave an awful twitch, not a jump exactly, but a twitch. But she was on the spot and said, 'That would be nice. I wonder if it's true. The Princess didn't mention it in her last letter.' And then he looked at her approvingly. There is something there. No one shall convince me otherwise." Olga suddenly burst out laughing. "What's the matter?" asked Georgie. "Oh, it's all so delicious," she said. "I never knew before how terribly interesting little things were. It's all wildly exciting, and there are 50 things going on just as exciting." Is it all of you who take such a tremendous interest in them that makes them so absorbing, or is it that they are absorbing in themselves, and ordinary dull people, not Risehomites, don't see how exciting they are? Tommy Luton's measles, the Quantock's secret, Elizabeth's lover, and to think that I believed I was coming to a backwater." Georgie held up his picture and half closed his eyes. "I believe it's finished," he said. "I shall have it framed and put it in my drawing room." This was a trap, and Olga fell into it. "Yes, it will look nice there," she said. "Really, Georgie, it is very clever of you." He began washing his brushes. "And what was your news?" he said. She got up from her seat. "I forgot all about it, with talking of the Quantock's secret," she said. "That just shows you I completely forgot, Georgie. I've just accepted an offer to sing in America, a 4 months' engagement at £50,000,000,000 a night. A penny less and I wouldn't have gone. But I really can't refuse. It's all been very sudden, but they want to produce Lucretia there before it appears in England. Then I come back and sing in London all summer. Oh, me!" There was a dead silence while Georgie dried his brushes. "When do you go?" he asked. "In about a fortnight." "Oh," said he. She moved down the room to the piano and shut it without speaking, while he folded the paper round his finished picture. "Why don't you come too?" she said at length. "It would do you no end of good, for you could get out of this darling twopenny place which will all go inside a nutshell. There are big things in the world, Georgie, seas, continents, people, movements, emotions. I told my Georgie I was going to ask you, and he thoroughly approves. We both like you, you know. It would be very lovely if you would come. Come for a couple of months, anyhow. Of course you'll be our guest. Please." The world at that moment had grown absolutely black to him, and it was by that he knew who, for him, was the light of it. He shook his head. "Why can't you come?" she said. He looked at her straight in the face. "Because I adore you," he said. End of chapter. Queen Lucia by E. F. Benson. Read for LibriVox.org by Martin Clifton. Chapter 16. The glad word went around Riseholme one March morning that the earliest flower in Perdita's garden was in bloom. The day was one of those glories of the English springtime, with large white clouds blown across wide spaces of blue sky by the southwest wind, and with swift shadows that bowled across the green below them. Parliament was in full conclave that day, and in the elms the rooks were busy. An awful flatness had succeeded Olga's departure. Riseholme naturally took a good deal of credit for the tremendous success which had attended the production of Lucretia, since it so rightly considered that the real cradle of the opera was here, where she had tried it over for the first time. Lucia seemed to remember it better than anybody, for she remembered all sorts of things which no one else had the faintest recollection of. How she had discussed music with Signor Cortese, and he had asked her where she had had her musical training. Such a treat to talk Italian with a Roman, lingua toscana in bocca romana, and what a wonderful evening it was. Poor Mrs. Colonel recollected very little of this, but Lucia had long been aware that her memory was going sadly. After producing Lucretia in New York, Olga had appeared in some of her old roles, notably in the part of Brunhilde, and Lucia was very reminiscent of that charming party of Christmas Day at dear Georgino's, when they had the tableau. Dear Olga was so simple and unspoiled. She had come to Lucia afterwards and asked her to tell her how she had worked out her scheme of gestures in the Awakening, and Lucia had been very glad indeed to give her a few hints. In fact, Lucia was quite herself. It was only her subjects whom it had been a little hard to stir up. Georgie in particular had been very listless and dull, and Lucia, for all her ingenuity, was a complete loss to find a reason for it. But today the warm inflowing tide of spring seemed to renovate the muddy flats, setting the weeds that had lain dank and dispirited a-floating again on the return of the water. No one could quite resist the magic of the season, and Georgie, who had intended out of mere politeness to go to see the earliest of Perdita's stupid flowers, having been warned of its epiphany by telephone from the Hurst, found, when he set foot outside his house on that warm, windy morning, that it would be interesting to stroll across the green first, and see if there was any news. All the news he had really cared about for the last 2 months was news from America, of which he had a small packet done up in a pink ribbon. After getting rid of Piggy, he went to the newspaper shop to get his Times, which most unaccountably had not arrived, and the sight of Todd's News in its yellow cover stirred his drowsy interest. Not one atom of light had ever been thrown on that extraordinary occurrence when Robert bought the whole issue, and though Olga never failed to inquire, he had not been able to give her the slightest additional information. Occasionally he set a languid trap for one of the Quantocks, but they never by any chance fell into it. The whole affair must be classed with problems like the origin of evil, among the insoluble mysteries of life. It was possible to get letters by the second post an hour earlier than the house-to-house delivery by calling at the office, and as Georgie was waiting for his Times, Mrs. Quantock came hurrying out of the post office with a small packet in her hands, which she was opening as she walked. She was so much absorbed by this that she did not see Georgie at all, though she passed quite close to him, and soon after she shed a registered envelope. At that the old familiar glamour began to steal over him again, and he found himself wondering with intensity what it contained. She was now some 100 yards in front of him, walking in the direction of the Hurst, and there could be no doubt that she too was on her way to see Perdita's first flower. He followed her, going more briskly than she, and began to catch her up. Soon, this time by accident, not in the manner in which, through eagerness, she had untidily cast the registered envelope away, she dropped a small paper, and Georgie picked it up, meaning to give it to her. It had printed matter on the front of it, and was clearly a small pamphlet. He could not possibly help seeing what that printed matter was, for it was in capital letters. Increase your height. Georgie quickened his step, and the old familiar glamour brightened round him. As soon as he got within speaking distance, he called to her, and turning round, like a guilty thing surprised, a little box flew out of her hand. As it fell, the lid came off, and there was scattered on the green grass a multitude of red lozenges. She gave a cry of dismay. "Oh, Mr. Georgie, how you startled me," she said. "Do help me to pick them up. Do you think the damp will have hurt them? Any news? I was so wrapped up in what I was doing that I've spoken to nobody." Georgie assisted in the recovery of the red lozenges. "You dropped this as you walked," he said. "I picked it up in order to give it to you." "Ah, that is kind. And did you see what it was?" "I couldn't help seeing the outside," said Georgie. She looked at him a moment, wondering what was the most prudent course. If she said nothing more, he would probably tell everybody. "Well, then, I shall let you into the whole secret," she said. "It's the most wonderful invention, and increases your height, whatever your age is, from 2 to 6 inches. Fancy! There are some exercises you have to do, rather like those yoga ones, every morning, and you eat 3 lozenges a day. Quite harmless they are, and then you soon begin to shoot up. It sounds incredible, doesn't it? But there are so many testimonials that I can't doubt it is genuine. Here's one of a man who grew 6 inches. I saw it advertised in some paper and sent for it. Only a guinea. What fun when Robert begins to see that I am taller than he is. But now, not a word. Don't tell dear Lucia whatever you do. She is half a head taller than I, and it would be no fun if everybody grew from 2 to 6 inches. You may write for them, and I'll give you the address, but you must tell nobody." "Too wonderful," said Georgie. "I shall watch you. Here we are. Look, there's Perdita's flower. What a beauty." It was not necessary to press the mermaid's tale, for Lucia had seen them from the music room, and they heard her high heels clacking over the polished floor of the hall. "Listen, no more need of high heels," said Mrs. Quantock, "and I've got something else to tell you. Lucia may hear that. Ah, dear Lucia, what a wonderful Perdita blossom! "Is it not?" said Lucia, blowing kisses to Georgie, and giving them to Daisy. "That shows spring is here, primavera, and Peppino's piccolo libro comes out today. I should not be a bit surprised if you each of you found a copy of it arrived before evening. Glorious! It's glorious!" Surely it was no wonder that Georgie's blood began to canter along his arteries again. There had been very pleasant exciting years before now, requiring for their fuel no more than was ready at this moment to keep up the fire. Mrs Quantock was on tiptoe, so to speak, to increase her height. Peppino was just delivered of a second of these vellum volumes with seals and tapes outside. Mrs Weston was going to become Mrs Colonel at the end of the week, and at the same hour and church Elizabeth was going to become Mrs Atkinson. Had these things no savour, because... "How is oo?" said Georgie, with a sudden flush of the springtime through him. "Me very well, sanku, and me so want to read Peppino's bookie. "Oo come in," said Lucia. "Everybody come in. Now who's got ickle bit news?" Mrs Quantock had been walking on her toes all across the hall, in anticipation of the happy time when she would be from 2 to 6 inches taller. As the animated pamphlet said, the world assumed a totally different aspect when you were even 2 inches taller. She was quite sorry to sit down. "Is next week very full with you, dear Lucia?" she asked. Lucia pressed her finger to her forehead. "Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday," she began. "No, not Tuesday. I am doing nothing on Tuesday. You want to be the death of me between you. Why?" "I hope that my dear friend Princess Popoffski will be staying with me," said Mrs Quantock. "Do get over your prejudice against spiritualism and give it a chance. Come to a seance on Tuesday. You too, of course, Georgie. I know better than to invite Lucia without you." Lucia put on a faraway look which she reserved for the masterpieces of music, and for Georgie's hopeless devotion. "Lovely, that will be lovely," she said. "Most interesting. I shall come with a perfectly open mind." Georgie scarcely lamented the annihilation of a mystery. He must surely have imagined the mystery, for it all collapsed like a card house if the princess was coming back. The seances had been most remarkable too, and he would have to get out his planchette again. "And what's going to happen on Wednesday?" he asked Lucia. "All I know is that I've not been asked. Me's offended." "Ickle surprise," said Lucia. "You're not engaged that evening, are you? Nor you, dear Daisy? That's lovely. 8 o'clock. No, I think 1:45. That will give us more time. I shan't tell you what it is." Mrs Quantock, grasping her lozenges, wondered how much taller she would be by then. As Lucia played to them, she drew a lozenge out of the box and put it into her mouth, in order to begin growing at once. It tasted rather bitter, but not unpleasantly so. End of chapter 16, and end of Queen Lucia by E. F. Benson.